Julie Linares is the executive director of the Human Security Center and a principal consultant to the European Parliament Intergroup on Religious Freedom. Julie, welcome to the show.
Hello, Dave. So good to be here.
I'm really excited to talk to you because I've been following you on Twitter for probably 3 years or so, and you've really been ahead of the curve on calling out Islamist extremist terror or Islamic extremist terror or jihadist terror or whatever phrase you want to use. I'll let you break down some phrases. You've been ahead of it. And one of the people that when I see the things that you tweet, I'm always like, she gets it, she understands it. So let's start. What brought you to this spot? How did you get involved in being one of the people that studies this, that talks about it, that consults about it?
Well, I read my first book on politics when I was 12, and I know that probably makes me sound like a complete geek, but I read my first book on politics when I was 12 about the conflict in Ireland, about Northern Ireland, and I was interested in why people were killing for their beliefs and for their ideology, and of course Ireland was more about nationalist terrorism rather than religious terrorism. I mean, there was a religious component in the sense that you had the IRA on the one hand that was Catholic, and you had the UDA and the other paramilitary organizations that were Protestant on the other hand. But anyway, I mean, that's how I got interested in conflict and why people were killing for wholly innocent people for their beliefs. And then 2 years later, of course, 9/11 happened, and I was 14 at the time. I remember it as it was yesterday. I wasn't in school that day. I was at home. I was ill. I was sitting on the couch. I was watching random television, and suddenly these horrific images appeared on my screen. And obviously, my first reaction was, this was a terrible, terrible tragedy and accident. But the moment the second plane hit the towers, I think everybody knew that whatever it was, and at the time, obviously, we were still lacking the rhetoric to describe what just happened. Mm-hmm. I realized that this was a game changer, that the world would never be the same again. And that is true. I mean, the world was never the same again after 9/11. And then obviously Afghanistan happened and Iraq happened. And when we went into Iraq, I was 16 at the time, and I think that was really the moment I would describe as my awakening, in the sense that I realized we were not just fighting the enemy from the outside, but also the enemy within. And I'm not talking about the people who opposed the war for perfectly legitimate reasons, mm-hmm. moral reasons, strategic reasons. I'm talking about the people who hijacked the anti-war movement and who were happy to call George W. Bush and Tony Blair war criminals, while at the same time turning around and embracing people like Hamas, a terrorist organization that preaches genocide against the Jews, and people like George Galloway, who was on record praising Saddam Hussein's courage, strength, infatigability. Yeah. And that was the moment when I realized, guys, we really have a problem and we need to talk about this.
Yeah, so I really want to dive into that because it's so related to everything we've been talking about here, this sort of moral confusion that people seem to have, and a lot of it, unfortunately, does seem to be on the left. The right's got plenty of moral confusion itself, but yeah, we seem to see a lot of it on the left. That's interesting. So because you were young around the time that 9/11 happened, I'm a little older than you. I lived in New York City at the time, and of course I had studied politics before, but of course it was a defining moment for me and for literally millions of people as well. So all that happens, and then when did you actually start working in this field and really sort of talking about this publicly and making that your life's work?
Well, I actually started writing a personal blog at the time the war in Iraq happened, and I talked about it a lot. I mean, that was the first thing I really talked about publicly a lot, about the reasons why, even though, as I said before, I always had great respect for the people who opposed the war for perfectly legitimate reasons, that I, however, felt there was also a moral and legitimate case for the war. I mean, look at the torture chambers and the concentration camps and the genocide against the Kurds. I think it was a former Kurdish president who once said that Iraq was a concentration camp above ground and a mass grave beneath. And that was true. It was one of the worst dictatorships on earth. And that's when I really got involved in this debate and was exposed to the wider public. And that was also the time really when people started attacking me for my views.
Yeah. So when people talk to you about the Iraq War now, I mean, the meme in America is that, you know, had we not toppled had we not toppled George W. Bush, had George W. Bush not toppled Saddam, that ultimately, had we not gone into Iraq, that ISIS wouldn't be here, basically, is the idea of it. And, you know, as I've talked to some experts in this, a lot of people are saying, well, Saddam, as you just said, was doing some pretty horrific things. So despite knowing now that there weren't weapons of mass destruction, or at least that we never found them, do you still, in your mind, do you feel that what we did was still a moral case? And what you guys did as well, obviously, you know, Tony Blair had something to do with it.
Yes, I still believe after everything that it was right to topple this regime. And, you know, some of the things that people were saying, why we shouldn't intervene, like at least Saddam Hussein contains Iran, for me really never was a moral argument. You cannot contain one dictatorship with a theocratic regime and vice versa. And for the Kurds, it was a liberation. I mean, look at Kurdistan today, Iraqi Kurdistan, and yeah, they are a beacon of hope in the entire region. And I obviously acknowledge that we did some things terribly wrong, which led to bloodshed and chaos, the dismantling of the Iraqi army, the de-Baathification, all of the big things really, I think were catastrophic. And I'm really happy to admit that. But it doesn't change the fact for me that this was a genocidal dictator. I mean, he committed a crime of all crimes. 95% of Kurdish villages were exposed to chemical weapons during the Al-Anfal campaign. And that is still the reason why I still believe after everything that it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, and that's not even to talk about what he was doing to dissidents and free thinkers and secularists and all sorts of other people.
Marsh Arabs, all of them, yeah.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about the type of work that you do now. What's actually the base work that you're doing?
Well, we do different things. We work with governments, of course. We work with non-governmental organizations. We work with the media. We work with the public. So we do public outreach. One of the things that we're currently doing is we are working with the European Parliament intergroup on religious freedom. And what we're doing for them basically is once a year, we are looking at the worst violators of religious freedom across the world, everything at really all continents, from Latin America to Asia to Africa. And we look at the sources of persecution. We look at why religious minorities in that particular country are targeted and by whom they are targeted and what we can do to help these people.
Yeah. All right. So who's doing most of the targeting?
Well, first of all, it is a phenomenon that affects all countries across all continents, really, and it also affects all religions. Of course, you have, for instance, the brutal persecution of Muslims in Burma by Buddhist extremists, and you have the persecution of Muslims by Christian militia in the Central African Republic, or you have the persecution of Christians by Hindu nationalists in India. But the vast majority of religious persecution we see in the world today has some kind of relation to the religion of Islam, whether it's by a state actor or a non-state actor.
Okay, so I had a feeling that's what you were going to say. So because we're the good guys in this case and we try to separate people from ideas, how do you guys, when you're studying this and you're learning about this, how do you separate what is done in the name of religion, in the name of doctrine, versus just the geopolitical realities on the ground?
Well, I mean, we look, for instance, at the law of the country and the constitution of the country. And what you will find in many of these countries is that the constitution in itself already discriminates against minorities. So, for instance, the president of the country can only be Muslim. And that is, of course, not just something that is purely decided on religious grounds. It's also a strategic decision, right? I mean, they want to keep power to themselves. but then you also have completely irrational persecution of minorities who can't do any harm whatsoever to the state because they are tiny minorities and they are deprived of all their rights. And that is, of course, when it's no longer strategic and when it really comes down also to religious doctrine. And I'm talking, for instance, about the Ahmadiyya Muslims, the Baha'is, in Sunni Muslim states, it's often the Shia. Again, that is both related to religion and geopolitics, so often it's also a mixture of both, and it's very difficult to tell whether it is for political or religious reasons that people are being persecuted. But yeah, I mean, there definitely is a problem that we have with religious-inspired persecution of minorities in the Muslim world.
Yeah, so I know you do a lot of work with and for the Kurds. We've been talking a bit about the Kurds here. It's an incredibly underreported story, especially in the States. Are they the best example of a persecuted minority? Because they're a minority in at least 4 countries. They never got their state when the whole thing was carved up. And they're basically treated incredibly poorly by Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. So are they really the best example for you when you're talking about this kind of stuff?
Well, I was joking a couple of weeks ago that I should get myself a T-shirt saying I supported the Kurds before it became fashionable, because now obviously, a lot of people talk about them. And don't get me wrong, I'm really, really pleased that people are finally giving them the attention and exposure that these wonderful and open-minded and largely peaceful and brave people deserve. And yes, I honestly believe that probably since the formation of the State of Israel in the 1940s, that what we're seeing with the Kurds, the struggle for self-determination, is probably the most promising democracy experiment in the Middle East. Because look at what the Kurds are doing. I mean, if you take Iraqi Kurdistan as an example, which is a semi-autonomous region in the north of the country, they have their own president and prime minister and parliament, and the Peshmerga, which is the army of the Kurdistan region. I mean, they have taken in hundreds of thousands of people from Syria, from Iraq, persecuted by the Islamic State, hunted by the Assad regime, including tens of thousands of Christians who otherwise would have been slaughtered or at least enslaved. They were able to celebrate Easter in safety and in peace. And it's not just that they are providing basic needs to these people, they are going a step further. They are actually trying to support the rights of these religious minorities. And last year, the Kurdistan region of Iraq did something that I feel is absolutely unique and historic. They decided to give to each of the minority communities, religious minority communities in Iraqi Kurdistan, their own official representation. So they all have their own representatives now, and
Wow.
not just the big ones, not just the Muslims and the Christians, no, also the Jews and the Baha'is and the Shabaks and the Ahmadiyya Muslims who are persecuted all across the Muslim world. And, these are not just token appointments. These guys are really doing work. The first Jewish representative just comes back from a visit from Israel, where he met with lawmakers and was trying to really find ways to build bridges between Israel and Kurdistan. And this is absolutely unique in that region. And it's fascinating if you think about the fact that just miles away from Erbil, where the Kurdish parliament sits,
Yeah.
the Islamic State is in place, and that is, of course, the most fundamental manifestation of radical Islam.
Yeah, I had a few weeks ago, I had Bayan Sami Abdul Rahman, who's the KRG rep to the United States, and we were talking about that border and how close everything is, and it's really crazy because basically the Kurds, the Peshmerga, they're fighting the ISIS on one side, and then they're also fighting Turkey on the other side, and Turkey is a NATO ally. Can you explain a little bit of the complexity there? Because it's really complex because there are also Kurds in Turkey, and they have a political party, and they're trying to negotiate with Turkey. It doesn't sound like it's going that well.
Well, you have to make a distinction between the Kurds in Iraq and the Kurds in Syria and the Kurds in Turkey and the Kurds in Iran, because they all have different goals, and they all have different relationships with Turkey as well. The relationship between the Kurdistan region of Iraq with Turkey is actually not that bad. It's the problem with the PKK in Turkey that is well, for many years now entrapped in a brutal conflict with the Turkish state. And of course, the PKK is allied to the GPJ in Syria, which now controls almost the entire border with Turkey. And Turkey is bombing the Kurds, the same people we are working with, the US is working with, to fight the Islamic State. So what we are actually seeing is that the US-led coalition is at war with itself.
Yeah, so what is that then? Because it seems like this is now an open secret that this is happening. The Kurds are fighting ISIS on the ground. They're basically the only fighting force on the ground fighting ISIS, and Turkey is bombing them, and we are a NATO ally with Turkey. So how is this secret being allowed? It's out, and we're not doing anything about it.
What Europe needs the cooperation of the Turkish state because of the refugee crisis, right? Turkey in many ways is the gateway from Syria to Europe, and they need Erdogan to play along. And that is one of the reasons why so many governments in Europe are hesitant to criticize the Turkish government for the way they are treating the Kurds, both in their own country and also in Syria.
Yeah, so Turkey basically is having their cake and eating it too, in that they're letting the fighters in through Europe, right? They come from Europe, they go through Turkey, they go in, and then Turkey is then bombing the Kurds because they're not thrilled with the Kurds, so it's good for them. And then we have to play ball with them because they're also the buffer zone. So that's like one of those cases where you can really see how complex this stuff is.
Yeah, I mean, basically what you can say is that Turkey is more afraid of a Kurdish state than it is of the Islamic State. And that's exactly, I mean, if you look at their policy and the way they react in the region, I think that's crystal clear, and we can't really deny that. And I personally agree with you that it's absolutely shameful that a NATO partner is bombing the organization, the group of people that is most efficient in fighting the Islamic State. Now, I'm not condemning by any means the terrorist attacks that we've seen inside Turkey by the PKK.
Right.
No terrorism is ever justified against anyone. I reject that when the Islamic State is doing that. I reject that when the IRA was doing that in Northern Ireland. I reject that when the PKK is doing that in Turkey. But it's more complex than just the PKK and the Turkish state. I mean, this goes way beyond Turkey just taking action against the PKK. They are really using this to sort of justify an entire crackdown on the Kurds within Turkey and the Kurds in Syria. And this basically goes hand in hand with an increased authoritarianism inside Turkey. If you look at the crackdown on the media, free speech, activists, this all goes hand in hand. It's not just the Kurds that are being targeted, it's free thinkers, everybody who dares to criticize President Erdogan.
Yeah, so I want to back up to something that you said about the Kurds a moment ago, that they've sent a representative to Israel. And I know that there are supposedly some other sort of behind the scenes relationships there, but does that sort of prove that at the end of the day, regardless of what religion people are, that having sort of the base human freedom and respect for minorities and things like that, that's what will make these countries succeed or fail? It's not a coincidence that the countries that seem to fail are the least tolerant. So that's a relationship that should be nurtured further, right?
Well, absolutely, and I think what you say is absolutely true. The Kurds are the best example because let's not forget, they are Muslims. The vast majority of Kurds are Muslims, and yet they practice an Islam that is inclusive and respectful to other people. And it is possible, it's not mutually exclusive to be Muslim as a person and be open-minded towards others. And the Kurds have a long-standing history and culture of tolerance and peaceful coexistence. So in that way, yes, the Kurds really are the best example and a beacon of hope in a region that is otherwise drowning in blood and mire.
Right, and it's a beautiful thing because it shows that religions don't always have to be their extremist parts. and that they're using there's strategic reasons in that area that they might want to partner up with Israel on things. So it gets the religion out of it, and it gets some of the geopolitics out of it.
Yes, and it's quite interesting if you go to Kurdistan and you talk to people about Israel and about America, you don't get this hostility that you get in many Arab countries, you know, where they perceive Israel and America as the worst of everything. And no, you get a very different attitude in Kurdistan, where they are looking at Israel and looking at America, and they're looking at our science and technology. You know, leave aside politics for a moment. Look at everything else.
Yeah.
You know, the pluralism that we have, the freedoms that we have, freedom of speech. Everybody, you know, has the right to do whatever they say and want. They admire that. They inspire to be like us, not in the sense that they are giving up their own culture, but having an open-minded view of the world that is compatible with the 21st century.